It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, winter camping in the wilds of the Adirondacks with a couple of close friends. We had planned it for months. The idea was simple: find a secluded area deep in the woods, set up camp, and escape the distractions of the modern world. It was going to be cold, but that was part of the charm. We packed our gear, grabbed our snowshoes, and set off to explore the untouched beauty of winter. When we arrived at the campsite, everything seemed perfect. The snow had a layer of fresh powder, the trees were heavy with frost, and there was a peaceful stillness in the air. We made our camp, set up our tents, and built a small fire to ward off the cold. It was just the four of us: me, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Laura, and our buddy Sam. We were all in our 20s, full of energy and eager for an adventure. The first night was fine. We sat around the fire, shared stories, and joked about the eerie quiet of the forest. There was something almost magical about the way the snow clung to everything. It was like the world had been frozen in time and nothing could disturb it. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the isolation and the cold. The second day, the weather began to shift. The clouds rolled in thick and heavy, obscuring the weak winter sun. A biting wind began to blow, and the temperature dropped dramatically. We decided to stay at camp for the day, huddling around the fire to stay warm. As the hours passed, I noticed that the wind was picking up, and I began to feel even more uneasy. The woods, once so quiet, now seemed different, almost alive. It was like the trees were watching us. By evening, the storm was in full force. Snow began to fall heavily, and the wind howled through the forest like some kind of wild animal. We made dinner in the shelter of the tents and huddled together, talking quietly. But as the storm raged outside, I could hear something else: a faint scratching sound. It was so soft at first that I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder. It was unmistakable. Something was scratching at the side of my tent. I held my breath and listened. Mark was sitting across from me, his face shadowed by the flickering firelight, but his eyes were wide with the same nervous tension I felt. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to him. He nodded, his expression grim. Sam and Laura, who were sitting next to the fire, had heard it too. "What the hell is that?" Sam asked, his voice low and tense. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails dragging across the fabric of the tent. Without thinking, we all grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside into the storm. The wind hit us hard, biting at our skin, and the snow swirled around us in blinding flurries. We stood there in the dark for a moment, staring into the white wilderness, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was nothing out there, no animals, no signs of movement, nothing. We checked the tents and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of anything. We tried to convince ourselves that it had been a branch scraping against the fabric or the wind causing the noise. But deep down, we knew something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched intensified, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, we huddled together in the largest tent, too scared to sleep, too paranoid to venture outside. The storm raged on, but now it felt different, more oppressive, as though the storm itself was angry, as though it was trying to force us into submission. I could hear Laura's breathing, quick and shallow, and I could feel Mark's tense form next to me. Sam and Laura were on the other side of the tent, but we were all wide awake, listening to every creak and groan of the fabric. Hours passed, and I was just beginning to nod off when I heard it again. The scratching sound, but this time it was louder. It came from the direction of the fire, just outside the tent. I bolted upright, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered urgently. Mark was already awake, his eyes wide in terror. "It's not the wind this time," he said, his voice hoarse with fear. "Something's out there." We all lay still, listening, the storm outside masking everything but the relentless scratching. It was slow, deliberate, like whatever was out there was toying with us. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going out there," I muttered, not sure whether I was trying to be brave or foolish. Before I could move, Sam grabbed my arm. "Don't. Whatever it is, it's not safe." But I was already up and moving toward the entrance. I couldn't ignore it. The curiosity gnawed at me, and I had to see for myself. I unzipped the flap of the tent, And as soon as I stepped outside, the wind slapped me in the face and the snow stung my eyes. But what I saw froze me in place. In the dim light of the fire, I could see deep, uneven gouges in the snow, as if something heavy had dragged itself across the ground. The marks led into the forest toward the trees. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Standing just at the edge of the firelight, barely visible in the storm, was a figure, a tall, thin shape, almost indistinct like a shadow made of snow. It stood perfectly still, watching us. I could barely make out its features. No face, just an endless darkness where a head should be, and long, gnarled limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Get back in the tent," I shouted. I don't know how, but we all managed to scramble back into the tent, the figure still standing in the distance, unmoving. We didn't say anything to each other, but we all knew we were not alone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and tension. Every little sound outside the tent made us jump. The scratching never stopped. It seemed to follow us wherever we went. By morning, the storm had subsided, but the unease remained. We packed up our camp in a hurry, no one speaking a word to each other. As we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. The trees loomed over us, dark and silent, as though they were watching our every move. We never spoke of what happened that night again, but I know the others felt it too. The terror that had taken hold of us was real, and I know that whatever we encountered in those woods wasn't something we could explain away. To this day, I don't go near the Adirondacks in winter. I don't camp, and I don't wander into the woods after dark. Whatever that thing was, I can still feel its presence sometimes, lurking in the cold just beyond my reach. And I'm sure it's still out there, waiting.
Next story.
It was supposed to be the perfect winter camping trip. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks, heading up to a remote campsite in the Appalachian Mountains for a long weekend. We wanted the solitude, the fresh air, and the opportunity to unplug. But what we didn't plan on was what we found there. What happened that weekend still haunts me to this day. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon, after a long drive up a winding, snow-covered road. The air was crisp and the ground was coated in a thick blanket of snow. Everything looked like a winter wonderland, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a Christmas postcard. We set up our tents near the edge of the woods, and as night fell, the sky opened up in a spectacular show of stars. But something about the place felt off. It's hard to explain. It was just an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. We started a fire and gathered around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The wind howled through the trees, and every now and then I could swear I heard something moving in the woods, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I tried to push the feeling aside, but it lingered. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to nothing but embers, we crawled into our tents to sleep. The cold seeped in through the fabric, and it felt like the temperature had dropped even further. The snow outside had started falling heavily, muffling all sound, and everything felt eerily still. I don't know what woke me up, but it was the sharp, sudden sound of a twig snapping just outside my tent. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I strained to listen. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Then came another snap. Closer this time. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I quietly unzipped the tent flap, poking my head out. The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. But sleep wouldn't come. The air outside grew colder, and a strange sensation washed over me, like something was watching. It wasn't just the normal fear you feel when you're in the woods at night. This was different. This was a primal, deep-rooted feeling that there was something out there, something that didn't belong. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, until finally, exhaustion took over and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sight of a bright, sunlit sky. The snow had stopped, and everything outside looked peaceful. My friends were already up, preparing breakfast by the campfire. I felt a bit silly for being so paranoid the night before, so I pushed the weird experience out of my mind and joined them. As we ate, one of my friends, Jake, mentioned something strange. He said he thought he had heard something in the woods in the middle of the night. But when he went to check, there was nothing there. We all laughed it off, chalking it up to the strange noises the woods make at night. We spent the day hiking through the snow-covered trails, laughing and joking, trying to enjoy the winter landscape. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of unease from the night before returned. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That evening, after dinner, we decided to sit around the fire once again. But this time, none of us felt like talking. It was as if we all sensed something was wrong, but none of us wanted to voice it. The shadows seemed deeper, the woods darker, and the air colder than it had been before. I had just gotten up to add more wood to the fire when I noticed something in the distance. Just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, there was a figure standing motionless. My heart skipped a beat. "Guys, do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the figure. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared. The figure remained still, barely moving. It looked like a person, but something was off. The way it stood, its posture, it didn't feel right. It was as if it wasn't human at all. "Probably just a hunter or something," Jake said, trying to brush it off, but I could tell from his voice that he wasn't so sure. We all stared at the figure for a long moment, the fire crackling in the silence. Finally, one of us, Alex, I think, decided to walk toward it. We watched her move slowly, cautiously, as if she were trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But as she got closer, the figure didn't move. It just stayed there, frozen. "Alex, don't!" I started to call out, but before I could finish, the figure disappeared, vanished into thin air. We all rushed toward where the figure had been, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow, no trace of anyone having been there at all. Just empty, silent woods. We were all on edge after that. The fire felt too small, too weak, and the wind seemed to scream louder than ever. It didn't help that as we sat in silence, we began to hear strange noises from the woods. Twigs snapping, the sound of something heavy moving through the snow. But when we looked, we saw nothing. I don't know how much time passed before we all decided to turn in for the night. We didn't say much as we crawled into our tents, but the air felt heavier, colder, and more suffocating than ever. I lay there wide awake, too afraid to close my eyes. It wasn't long before I heard it again, another twig snapping outside my tent. But this time, it wasn't just one snap. It was multiple, all around me. I could hear the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow drawing closer. My breath caught in my throat as I lay as still as possible, not daring to make a sound. Suddenly, the tent flap was yanked open. My heart nearly stopped. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt a cold, unnatural presence looming over me. I could hear something breathing, deep, rasping breaths, as if whatever it was standing outside my tent had never taken a single breath of fresh air in its life. Without thinking, I bolted out of the tent, running blindly into the snow. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer, echoing in my mind. I ran toward the fire, not knowing where anyone else was. When I reached it, the camp was completely deserted. The tents were empty, the fire was out, and there was no sign of my friends. Just the deep, haunting silence of the woods. I stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was I hallucinating? But I could feel it. The presence was still there. Watching. I spent the rest of the night wandering aimlessly through the woods, terrified of whatever was following me, but I never saw it. I heard it, though. I heard it breathing, getting closer with every step. The next morning, when I finally found my way back to the road, I managed to hitch a ride into town. I never saw my friends again. No one believes me when I tell them what happened. Some say it was just an animal. Others say I was imagining things. But I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I can explain. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting for the next group of campers to wander into its domain.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple winter camping trip. My friends and I had done it many times before, hiking out into the woods to enjoy some time in nature, away from the distractions of everyday life. But something changed that year. Something dark and terrifying. It started innocently enough. We had all been working hard, and after a long semester of college exams and assignments, we decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded spot in the Appalachian Mountains. None of us had been there before, but we had a map and the plan to follow the well-trodden trails that led up to a cabin where we could set up our camp. The forecast promised a cold but clear weekend, perfect for some quiet time away. We arrived on the afternoon of the first day. The air was crisp, the snow covered the ground like a thick white blanket, and everything seemed peaceful. We laughed as we unloaded our gear, set up tents, and started a fire. The crackling of the flames was soothing against the backdrop of the snowy woods, and we joked around, trying to stay warm as the temperatures began to drop. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, but we felt safe inside our tents. I tried to ignore the feeling that something was off, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't shake. It was as if the woods themselves were watching us. My friends felt it too, but we all shrugged it off as just our imaginations running wild. The second day was when things started to get weird. We woke up to the eerie silence that accompanies deep snow. It was an unsettling stillness, like the world had been muffled, like it was holding its breath. We decided to go for a short hike to explore the area. The snow was deep, but the trail was well marked, and we moved at a steady pace, enjoying the peace and beauty of the forest. It was about midday when we reached the top of a small hill. As I stood there, looking out over the snowy landscape, I noticed something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, perhaps the remnants of a fallen tree. But as I squinted, I realized it was a figure, a person, standing perfectly still in the snow. I nudged my friend Jared, pointing in the direction of the figure. "Do you see that?" I asked. He looked and froze. His face turned pale. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered. We all stared at the figure, trying to make sense of it. It was too far away to tell any details, but it was definitely a person. But who would be out here alone in the middle of winter? And why was it just standing there, motionless? We debated whether we should approach, but after a long moment, the figure disappeared behind some trees, vanishing into the woods without a sound. My heart raced as we exchanged uneasy glances. There was something wrong. No one in their right mind would be out here, especially not alone. We decided to head back to camp, but as we descended the hill, a chill swept over me, not from the cold, but from an overwhelming sense of dread. The woods felt alive, and not in a comforting way. It was as though they were hiding something that didn't want us there. When we returned to camp, we found that our fire had gone out. We were all too tired to relight it right away, so we huddled inside our tents. The wind outside howled louder than before, and I heard something else too, a low, faint sound, like a whisper drifting through the flaps of my tent. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was calling out, soft and far away. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing slightly louder, more distinct. My heart pounded in my chest. I unzipped the flap of the tent just a crack and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast long shadows across the snow, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving, but then it was gone. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jared, who was sitting next to me. He looked up, his face pale and eyes wide. "I thought I was the only one," he said. "I thought it was just the wind or something. But no, that wasn't the wind." We decided to leave our tents and build the fire back up, trying to convince ourselves it was just the stress of the cold and isolation getting to our heads. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more insistent. Soon it wasn't just one voice, it was many. A chorus of soft murmurs that echoed through the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, begging. I was terrified now, but we all tried to stay calm. "It's probably just animals," Jared said, his voice shaking. "Maybe some coyotes or something. They can sound weird at night." But even as he said that, we all knew it wasn't animals. It was something human, something trapped in the woods. Later that night, I woke up to a sudden pounding noise. It sounded like someone was banging on the side of my tent, but when I unzipped the flap to check, no one was there. My heart was hammering in my chest as I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The fire was still burning, but its light felt feeble, like it couldn't push back the darkness that had settled over the forest. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, crunching the frozen ground with each step. I turned to see Jared standing just outside my tent, staring into the woods with wide, unblinking eyes. "Jared?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, like a puppet with its strings cut. And then, with a suddenness that made my skin crawl, he turned and began to walk into the woods, his feet crunching in the snow with each step. "Jared!" I screamed, rushing after him. "What the hell are you doing?" But he didn't stop. He just kept walking, heading deeper into the trees as if something was pulling him. I followed him, but my legs felt heavy, like the snow was sucking me in, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I couldn't lose him. I couldn't let him wander off into the woods, not with whatever was out there. I didn't know how long I had been running when I finally saw him again. He was standing in front of a large old tree, its branches twisted and gnarled. The moonlight barely reached the ground around it, but I could see something strange on the tree's trunk. Scratches, deep and jagged, like something had clawed at it for years. "Jared!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "What the hell are you doing?" He turned to me slowly, his face blank, like he didn't recognize me. His eyes were wide and unseeing, as though he were lost in some terrible trance. "Help me," he whispered hoarsely. "It wants us. It won't let us leave." Before I could say anything else, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the depths of the woods. Something huge, something primal was moving toward us. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed Jared by the arm and yanked him away from the tree, pulling him toward the camp as fast as I could. We barely made it back before something or someone came out of the woods after us. We could hear the growls, the shuffling of feet, the low, dragging breaths. I had no idea what it was, but it was close. Too close. When we reached the camp, we quickly threw our things together and ran. We didn't stop to pack, didn't look back. We just ran. We ran until we hit the main trail, until we were sure we were far enough away from whatever had been stalking us. By the time we reached our car, the sun had begun to rise, casting light on the snow-covered woods we had fled from. We didn't speak much as we loaded up and left. There were no words to explain what had happened, no way to describe the terror we had experienced. But I know one thing for sure. Something was out there. Something that didn't want us to leave. And it's still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to make the mistake of venturing into those cursed woods.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a fun adventure, a weekend in the wilderness, testing our limits and pushing our endurance. But what started as an innocent camping trip in the mountains quickly turned into a fight for survival. I don't think we'll ever be the same after what happened that winter. It all started when my friend Brad and I decided to take on a remote winter camping trail in the Cascade Range in Washington. It was a relatively unknown spot, a place where we could get away from everyone and truly experience nature at its most raw. The plan was simple: hike up, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights out there before heading back down. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, the wind already picking up as we drove up the winding road toward the trailhead. The snow was thick, and it felt like we were driving through a dream. As we pulled into the parking lot, the quiet of the place hit me. There was no sound other than the crunch of snow under the tires. No voices, no cars, just a deep, overwhelming silence. "Perfect," Brad said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. No one else around, just us and nature. I smiled, though a part of me felt uneasy. Maybe it was just the isolation or the way the trees seemed to loom around us like they were closing in. I shrugged it off, though. After all, we were experienced hikers, and this wasn't our first time out in the cold. We started our hike late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the mountain peaks. The trail was icy, and the snow was deeper than we had expected, but it wasn't too difficult to manage. We were about an hour in when the first sign that something was wrong appeared. Brad stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he asked, looking around. I paused, straining to listen. There was nothing. Just the wind whistling through the trees, the crunch of snow beneath our boots. "I don't hear anything," I said. "No, really," he insisted. "It sounds like a voice." I furrowed my brow, scanning the woods around us. "It's probably just the wind," I said, though the way the branches moved in the gusts made me uneasy. Brad looked at me for a long moment and then shrugged. "Probably, but it felt off." We kept going, pushing through the trees as the sun continued to set, the shadows stretching long across the snow. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that the strange feelings started to intensify. The clearing was wide open, the snow untouched by footprints, a smooth, almost eerie surface reflecting the dimming light. In the center, there was something out of place, a small structure, barely visible through the falling snow, an old, dilapidated cabin. It was in disrepair, its roof sagging, windows broken, and a door that hung ajar as if inviting us in. "That's not on the map," Brad said, his voice tight with suspicion. "Let's just keep moving," I suggested, uneasy about the sudden appearance of the cabin. But as we turned to leave, we both heard it. A faint voice, a whisper carried by the wind, calling our names. "Did you hear that?" Brad's voice was shaky now. "Yeah," I said, my heart racing. It was coming from the direction of the cabin. We looked at each other, both of us feeling the same knot of dread settle in our stomachs. It was as if the entire forest had gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting for us to make a decision. "Let's check it out," Brad said, his voice barely a whisper, as if the cabin itself might hear us. I didn't want to, but I nodded. We had to know. Maybe it was someone else lost or in trouble and we could help. It seemed like the right thing to do, despite everything inside me telling me to turn and run. We approached the cabin cautiously, the snow crunching underfoot as we moved closer. The door creaked on its hinges, as if opening on its own accord, inviting us in. A chill ran down my spine as we stepped inside. The air in the cabin was cold, too cold, even for the winter outside. There was an eerie stillness to the place, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The only light came from the dim glow of the moon through the broken windows. It didn't take long to see that the cabin had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. There was old furniture covered in dust, torn curtains fluttering in the wind, and strange symbols carved into the walls, ones I didn't recognize. But it was the smell that hit us next, the smell of decay. It wasn't just the scent of a rotting cabin, it was something else, something worse. And then we heard it again, the voice. This time it was clearer, more distinct, almost like someone was whispering directly into our ears. "Get out! Now! Get out!" Brad and I exchanged a look, both of us frozen in place. The temperature dropped even more, the air thick with something oppressive. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew it was time to leave. But as we turned to go, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the walls. We were trapped. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Brad was already pacing, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "Something's really wrong." I could feel it too. It was like the cabin itself was alive, breathing, watching us, as if it was aware of our presence. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor creaked underfoot like something was moving beneath us. Suddenly, the whispering returned, this time louder, surrounding us. "You're not alone. You're never alone." I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one there, but I felt eyes on me, the unmistakable sensation of being watched from every corner of the room. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure, a person, or something that had once been a person, its face twisted in agony. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, and I felt like I was suffocating. Brad, too, was backing away from the thing, his eyes wide with terror. "Get out!" The voice screamed, louder now, echoing in the cabin. "Before it's too late!" But it was too late. The door flung open on its own, and in the doorway stood something. No, someone. But it wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were black, like two endless pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. It smiled, a twisted grin that made my blood run cold. "Stay with us," it whispered, its voice like the wind, cold and unforgiving. "You're never leaving." Without thinking, we ran, pushing past the figure in the doorway and stumbling back into the snow. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We just ran, our lungs burning with each step, our legs screaming for us to stop. But we couldn't. The snow seemed endless, the forest stretching out around us as if trying to swallow us whole. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, breathless and terrified, the cabin now a distant memory, if it even existed at all. Brad and I never spoke of what happened that night. We never returned to that place, never even mentioned the trip again. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I still hear that voice. The whispers, the calls, the promise that we'll never be alone.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a fun getaway. A break from the city, a chance to get some fresh air, clear our minds, and reconnect with nature. But none of us could have known how wrong everything would go when we set up camp in those woods. My brother Ethan, our two friends, Sarah and Chris, and me had picked a remote spot deep in the forest for a weekend of winter camping. It was the kind of place you'd have to hike for miles to reach, the kind of place that felt like the perfect escape from the chaos of our daily lives. The plan was simple: hike, camp, cook over an open fire, and enjoy the quiet beauty of nature. The hike in was tough but manageable, the winter chill biting at our cheeks and snow crunching under our boots with each step. We finally arrived at the campsite just as dusk started to settle in. The trees around us were thick, their branches heavy with snow, and everything was so quiet it almost felt like the forest was holding its breath. We set up camp quickly, eager to settle in before the cold really set in. The fire crackled as we gathered around it, warming our hands and faces. The flickering light cast long shadows that danced against the snow, and for a while we laughed and joked as if nothing could go wrong. But something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and every now and then I'd catch myself glancing into the woods beyond our camp, where the shadows seemed too deep, too still. That night, after we'd all turned in and the wind started to howl outside, I lay in my tent, listening to the creaking of the trees and the distant sound of wind pushing through the snow. But it wasn't just the wind that kept me awake. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, in the dark, watching us. I could hear faint noises coming from the woods, twigs snapping, the soft shuffle of footsteps in the snow. But every time I looked outside, there was nothing. At first, I told myself it was just like my imagination, or maybe an animal moving through the woods. But that thought didn't sit well with me. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that animals usually avoid humans, especially at night. And these sounds weren't like any animal I knew. I tried to brush it off, but sleep was elusive. Hours passed, and just as I thought I was finally drifting off, I heard it again. This time, closer. The sound of something, or someone, moving just outside my tent. My heart raced in my chest. I was too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. The footsteps stopped, then came a sound that chilled me to my bones. A slow, heavy breathing, like someone was standing right outside my tent, just inches away. I held my breath, praying it was just the wind. But then the breathing stopped, and I heard something else. Soft, raspy whispers, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably human. My mind raced. I wasn't alone out here. I sat frozen in the dark for what felt like an eternity, listening to the whispers, wondering if my friends were hearing the same things. The terror I felt was palpable, a feeling so thick it was like I could taste it in the air. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. There, in the flickering light of the dying fire, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood just at the edge of the camp, half hidden by the trees. It wasn't tall, and it wasn't entirely human. The figure was hunched over, its limbs too long, its body unnaturally thin. Its skin seemed pale in the firelight, almost translucent. But what really made my stomach turn was the face. It was gaunt, hollowed, like something that hadn't eaten in years. And its eyes, those eyes, they were dark and empty, like there was nothing behind them, just voids staring into the night. I gasped, and the figure's head jerked toward the sound, locking its eyes on mine. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed the tent flap shut, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands trembled as I tried to stay quiet, praying whatever that thing was would go away. But the longer I waited, the more I could hear. It was moving closer, slow and deliberate, its footsteps soft in the snow. In the distance, I heard the faint rustling of my friends moving in their tents. They had heard it too. "Ethan?" I whispered in a trembling voice, my throat dry. "Sarah? Chris?" There was no answer. I crawled to the entrance of the tent, unzipped it just enough to stick my head out, and looked around. The camp was still, too still. The fire had almost gone out, and the shadows had deepened in the woods, but I didn't see the figure anymore. Then, without warning, I heard it again, louder this time. The sound of something dragging through the snow, heavy and unnatural. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my gear and bolted out of the tent. I ran toward the trees, not even looking behind me. I could feel the cold biting at my skin, but I didn't care. I just had to get away. I heard shouting behind me, my friends finally realizing what was happening, calling my name, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The farther I ran, the colder it got. The snow was thick, and every step felt heavier than the last. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. But then something happened. Something I still can't explain. The air grew colder, much colder than it should have been, and I could feel it. Something was wrong. The shadows in the woods seemed to shift, to move. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushed my shoulder, and I whipped around, but no one was there. I stumbled back, tripping over a tree root, and fell into the snow. That's when I saw it. The figure was standing right in front of me, its face inches from mine. The hollow eyes stared into my soul, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was like I could hear its thoughts. Nothing but hunger, pure and unrelenting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The cold, suffocating presence lifted, and the silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. When I finally managed to get up, I ran. No, I bolted back to the camp. But when I returned, my friends were gone. Their tents were empty, their gear scattered around, but they weren't there. I spent the rest of the night alone in the woods, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to even close my eyes. By morning, when I made my way back to the trail, I finally found my way to civilization. No one believes me. They think I imagined it all, that I got lost, that it was just my fear playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Whatever that thing was in the woods, it wasn't human, and I don't think it ever left. I know it's still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander into its domain.
Next story.
I've never been one for superstitions or ghost stories. Growing up in a small town, we were surrounded by rumors of haunted forests and forgotten places, but I never gave them much thought. That all changed one winter night when I went camping in the woods with my brother Owen. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, but it turned into a nightmare we never could have imagined. We'd always been close, Owen and I, but there had always been a certain sense of rivalry between us. He was the older brother, always tougher, always braver. I was the younger one, trying to prove I could keep up. So, when he suggested we go on a winter camping trip, I didn't hesitate. I wanted to show him I was just as capable as he was. We drove out to a remote area in the White Mountains where few people ever ventured in the winter months. The kind of place where the silence is so thick, it feels like the snow itself is trying to swallow the world. We arrived just before dark, the cold already biting through our jackets. The forecast had warned of a storm rolling in, but we were used to the harsh conditions. We weren't afraid of a little snow. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, built a fire, and joked around, as brothers do. There was something eerie about the woods, but nothing that stood out at first. The snow, the trees, and the vast emptiness around us all felt normal, until the wind picked up. As the night deepened, the wind howled through the trees, a low moan that seemed to come from all directions. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. There was a coldness in the air that seeped into my bones. Every now and then, I could have sworn I heard something else. Voices, soft whispers carried on the wind. I asked Owen if he heard them too, but he just shrugged it off. "You're imagining things," he said. "It's just the wind." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was as if something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I told myself it was just the isolation, the deep winter, and the long hours of silence playing tricks on my mind. The next day, things took a strange turn. We decided to go for a hike, to stretch our legs and explore the area a bit. As we trudged through the deep snow, the forest grew denser. It was beautiful, yes, but something about the way the trees twisted and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally gave me a sense of unease. We stumbled upon an old cabin, hidden in the woods, nearly buried beneath the snow. It was an eerie sight, dilapidated, with broken windows and a roof sagging under the weight of the snow. It didn't belong there. It was out of place. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Owen grinned. "Let's check it out." I hesitated. There was something about the cabin that made my stomach twist, but Owen's excitement was infectious. We approached the door, which was ajar, creaking as the wind pushed against it. Inside, the air was musty, cold, and damp. Dust covered everything, but it wasn't the dust of a forgotten cabin. It was fresh, like the cabin had been used recently. We stepped inside, our footsteps muffled by the snow beneath us. The smell of rotting wood mixed with something else, something sour. As we explored the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The walls were covered in strange symbols, runes or markings I didn't recognize, and there was a faint hum in the air, like an energy that didn't belong. My skin prickled with a cold that wasn't from the temperature. Then Owen found something that sent a chill down my spine. He pulled something out from under a collapsed table, a journal, yellowed and frayed, its pages brittle from age. He flipped through it, muttering under his breath. The journal was written in a language that neither of us recognized, but the drawings, the symbols, they were unmistakable. It was some kind of ritualistic book. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I told Owen we needed to leave, that we were in over our heads, but he was too engrossed in the book to listen. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, crunching in the snow. I turned around, but no one was there, just the trees, the shadows, the silence. "Owen," I said, my voice tight, "let's go, now." But he didn't hear me. He was still flipping through the pages, muttering under his breath like he was in a trance. "Owen," I shouted, stepping closer to him. "We need to get out of here. This place isn't right." He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide, but his face was different, pale, drained, like all the life had been sucked out of him. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, eerie, almost inhuman. "We're not alone," he whispered, his voice raspy, unnatural. "It's here." A sudden rush of fear shot through me. The hum in the cabin grew louder, vibrating the walls, the air thick with an oppressive energy. It felt like the cabin was alive, like it was breathing with us, pulsing in sync with the beating of my heart. I grabbed Owen by the arm, pulling him away from the journal, trying to break whatever hold it had on him. He resisted, his eyes now wide with terror, his hands clawing at mine, desperate to stay where he was. Then I saw it. Through the window, in the distance, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as it stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. I could barely make out its features, but I saw its eyes. Black, empty pits that seemed to draw in the light around it. Something about the figure felt wrong. Its movement wasn't human. It was unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding instead of walking. "We have to leave," I begged, pulling Owen toward the door. But he didn't move. Instead, he turned toward the figure outside, his face now locked in an expression of fear and awe. "It's calling me," he said, his voice distant. The hum grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the cabin. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could feel it closing in, pressing down on us, and I knew that if we didn't leave now, we would never leave. With one final effort, I yanked Owen away from the window, pulling him into the cold, snowy forest. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, the crunch of our boots lost in the wind, the figure's shadow lurking behind us, always just out of reach. But I could feel it following us, could hear its movements, the unnatural silence surrounding it, suffocating the air around us. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, exhausted and terrified. The figure never came close, but its presence hung in the air like it was watching us, waiting. We didn't speak much on the way back to the car. There were no jokes, no bravado, just fear. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know it was something ancient, something that had been waiting for us, hidden in the woods, hidden in the snow. Owen and I never spoke of it again, and we've never been camping in the mountains since. But sometimes when the wind picks up and the snow begins to fall, I can still hear that hum, and I can still feel its eyes on me.
Next story.
We were supposed to be in the mountains for a weekend, just a simple winter camping trip. My cousin Tyler and I had been talking about it for months. We both loved the outdoors, and it was the perfect opportunity to escape the chaos of our lives, even if just for a few days. We didn't want to do anything too fancy, just a basic camp setup with some tents, a campfire, and plenty of gear. The snow had been heavy that season, which was exactly what we wanted. peaceful, snowy woods with a blanket of quiet. We arrived at the site just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a pale orange light over the snow-covered trees. The air was crisp and sharp. It felt like we had driven far enough into the mountains to get completely away from civilization. That was part of the appeal, right? Just us, the forest, and the open sky. We set up camp quickly, but the cold was biting, and soon the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving us in the shadow of the trees. As we sat around the fire, we joked about how quiet it was. Too quiet, almost. It wasn't like the usual sounds of the woods you'd hear, the rustling of animals, the wind through the branches. Instead, it was just silence. A deep, almost oppressive silence. Tyler was getting nervous, and I could tell. He kept glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, his eyes constantly darting to the edge of the tree line. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. The uneasy pressure, like something was watching us from out there in the darkness. "Stop being paranoid," I said, trying to sound convincing. "It's just the woods. You're imagining things." But that night, after the fire had burned down to embers, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind outside. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, as if something was moving just outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the shuffle of paws on snow, it was a dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled across the ground. My heart started to race. I held my breath and listened, hoping it was just my imagination. But then there was a noise, a low groan. Not an animal sound, but something more human. I froze. My mind raced, and I felt the cold sweat begin to gather at the back of my neck. There was no way in hell that was an animal. But I couldn't convince myself to leave the tent. The silence returned, suffocating and thick, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Around midnight, I heard Tyler whisper my name through the fabric of the tent. "Hey, are you awake?" I responded quietly. "Yeah, I'm awake." "Did you hear that?" He didn't say anything for a moment, then replied, "Something's out there. I swear I saw something." I felt a chill run through me, colder than the air outside. I slowly unzipped the flap of the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still a smoldering pile of embers, casting faint orange light into the snow. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches sagging under the weight, but I didn't see anything. Not at first. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. In the snow. Dragging marks like something had been pulled across the ground, and they weren't animal tracks. They were large, too wide, too deep, and they led into the woods, straight into the darkness. I felt a knot form in my stomach. The unease I had been feeling all day suddenly exploded into full-blown panic. Tyler was right. Something was out there. Before I could say anything, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate dragging sound coming closer, like something was moving just outside the fire's reach. I snapped the flap shut, and we both sat there in the dark, silent. The sound stopped. It was as if whatever it was waiting just beyond our sight. "Tyler," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." But he didn't respond. I turned to look at him, and that's when I saw it. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "There's something in the woods," he said, his voice barely audible. Something not human." I felt my heart slam against my chest as a cold wave of fear swept over me. Without a word, we packed up what little gear we could and scrambled out of the tent. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind howled through the trees. But as we moved, I could feel it. Something was following us. We didn't speak as we made our way through the woods, our breath coming in sharp gasps. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the silent trees, the muffled crunch of snow beneath our feet. Then we reached the edge of the clearing where the path back to the car was. I thought we were safe. Too far from the campsite, too close to the road. But when we turned to look back, we saw something that stopped us in our tracks. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the tree line just outside the light of the fire. It wasn't fully visible, but there was something wrong about it. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and it didn't move like a person. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, like they were bent in strange angles. But worst of all was its face, or lack of one. Where a face should be, there was just smooth, pale skin. No eyes, no nose, just emptiness. I couldn't look at it for long. I turned away, but I knew it was watching us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Tyler's arm. We bolted, our feet slipping on the snow as we tried to make it back to the car, but the path seemed endless. The forest was closing in around us, the darkness pressing against us from all sides. The sound of dragging followed us, slow and steady, like whatever was behind us was content to let us run for now. I didn't know how far we had gone when we finally saw the glow of headlights through the trees. It was our car, parked in the clearing. We didn't stop to look back. We just jumped into the car, slammed the doors shut, and sped out of there without a second thought. The whole way back to town, neither of us said a word. The silence in the car was suffocating. We never talked about what happened that night again, not to each other, not to anyone else. We couldn't. There were no words for it, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear that dragging sound, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next person who dares to wander into those woods.
Next story.
It was supposed to be just a simple weekend getaway, a chance to get away from the noise of everyday life, to escape the endless demands of work in the city. My friends and I had made plans months in advance for a winter camping trip, something we'd never done before. We had all the necessary gear: warm sleeping bags, enough food to last us through the weekend, snowshoes, and even a small portable stove. The idea was to enjoy nature, build a fire, and spend a few days in isolation, away from the distractions of our usual lives. The place we chose was an old, out-of-the-way forest preserve up in the Catskills, a couple of hours outside of the city. The forest was known for its serenity, with few visitors and even fewer people willing to brave the cold temperatures of late December. We knew it would be a challenge, but that was part of the appeal. As soon as we arrived, we realized how isolated we really were. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant crunch of our boots in the snow. The entire place felt untouched, wild, and pristine. We set up camp near a small creek that ran through the forest, its waters frozen in parts but still running beneath the surface in others. The setting felt magical, just the kind of place you'd read about in stories. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the temperature dropped rapidly, and we gathered around the fire, huddling close for warmth. The first night was peaceful enough. We shared stories, cracked jokes, and talked about our hopes for the next day's hike. The fire flickered brightly against the deepening night, and the forest was so still that it almost felt like time had slowed down. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. An unease settled over me, a sensation I tried to ignore. It wasn't until later, when we were all getting ready to sleep in our tents, that I realized the true source of my discomfort. I hadn't heard any animals. The usual sounds of the forest that would come in the evening, the rustling of leaves or the distant calls of owls or coyotes. There was nothing. It was as though all the life in the forest had simply disappeared. I told myself it was just the cold, that animals were probably staying deep in their dens, but it felt wrong. The silence was unnatural. The night dragged on, and I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low, hollow moan, almost like wind, but it wasn't coming from the trees. It sounded like something was moving, something large, just outside the tent. I lay perfectly still, heart pounding, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a series of sharp cracks like dry branches snapping underfoot. I reached over to shake my friend Tom awake, but before I could, I heard a voice. Not one of my friends, but a voice in the distance, faint and almost childlike. The words were too muffled to understand, but the tone sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath. The voice sounded like it was coming from deeper in the forest, from beyond the light of our campfire. It was so faint, like a whisper on the wind, and yet it was unmistakable. Human, but eerie, almost pleading. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Tom, shaking him gently. Tom stirred, his eyes barely open. "What? That voice," I said. "I swear, I heard something." Tom furrowed his brow, not yet fully awake. "Maybe it's the wind, man. You're just freaking yourself out." But I wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of dread. And then the voice came again, closer this time, sharper, more distinct. "Help, help, please." This time, it was unmistakable. The voice was crying for help. I wasn't sure what to do. Should we check it out? Should we ignore it and stay inside the safety of the tent? It didn't sound like a person lost in the woods. It sounded different. The pleading, desperate tone felt wrong, like it wasn't coming from someone who was truly alive. "Wake the others," I whispered, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. I crawled over to the tent flap, my heart racing, and cautiously pulled it open just a crack. The air was freezing, and the cold stung my face as I peered out into the darkness. Nothing. There was no one there. The voice had stopped. I turned back to Tom and the others. "We need to leave. Now." "What are you talking about?" Tom groggily replied. "It's probably just some animal. We're fine." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't sure either. Something was off. We weren't alone. The air outside was thick with the same eerie silence. The fire flickered weakly in the wind, casting long, twisting shadows. It felt like the forest was closing in on us, pressing in from all sides. We quickly gathered our things, all of us moving on edge. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt like a maze of dark, oppressive trees. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the sense that we were being watched. As we packed up, I kept hearing something in the distance, a faint rustling in the snow, almost like footsteps, but there was no one around. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. "We're not alone," I said, my voice shaking. "Something's out there. We need to go, now." Tom tried to calm me down, but I saw it in his eyes. He felt it too. The growing sense of dread, the suffocating fear, whatever it was that had been watching us, whatever had cried out in the night, it was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. We didn't wait any longer. With trembling hands, we hurriedly tore down the camp and grabbed our gear. As we moved through the trees toward the trailhead, the sense of being followed grew stronger. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, and I kept hearing those faint footsteps crunching in the snow behind us. When we finally reached the road, we didn't look back. The night felt endless. As we stumbled back to our car, each step filled with the knowledge that something was just out of sight, watching, waiting. We didn't speak as we drove away, but the weight of the silence in the car was heavier than anything I'd felt before. To this day, I don't know what we heard that night. We never found any trace of another person in the woods. The rangers who came to investigate the next day said there had been no reports of anyone lost in the area. But I know what I heard. I know what we felt. Whatever it was, whatever we encountered out there in the woods, it wasn't human. And I have no intention of ever going back to that place.
Next story.
I had never been one for superstition. Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, I'd always thought of myself as a bit of a skeptic, someone who preferred logic over the strange tales that locals love to spin. The stories of the haunted woods near Pinecrest, where the trees seemed to whisper and the wind carried voices, had always seemed like just that, stories. Nothing more. But after what happened that winter, I don't know if I can say the same anymore. It started innocently enough. My friend Adam and I had been talking about taking a winter camping trip for months. Both of us had been through some tough times and figured that getting out into nature might be just the thing we needed to clear our heads. We knew the area well enough. The Pinecrest Woods were a familiar place to us. Sure, we had heard the rumors, but we never really paid them much mind. We packed our gear, grabbed a map, and headed out on a Friday afternoon, ready to disconnect and forget about everything. We made good time getting up there, and by nightfall we had found a secluded spot near a small clearing, a place we'd been to before during the summer. It felt familiar, safe. The snow had started to fall lightly, but nothing too serious. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and started a fire as the sun dipped behind the trees. We laughed, told stories, and watched the smoke curl up into the crisp evening air. Everything felt normal, too normal, if I'm being honest. But as the night deepened, the temperature dropped and the wind began to pick up. That was when I started to feel it, the unease. The air had this thickness to it, like something was watching us from the darkness. I tried to shake it off, but the sensation grew stronger the longer we sat there. Adam noticed it too. He stopped talking mid-sentence and stared out into the trees, his face pale in the firelight. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I hadn't heard anything at first. But then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, There was a sound, a low, rumbling growl. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The noise seemed wrong. It was almost human. Probably a bear or something, I said, trying to brush it off, though I could feel my heart rate picking up. We both knew there were no bears in the area this time of year, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to let on how scared I really was. Adam was already standing, his hand on the hilt of his knife, his eyes scanning the dark. "We need to be quiet," he said. "Whatever it is, it's close." We didn't speak after that. Instead, we just sat in silence, listening. The growl came again, closer this time, so close that I could feel the vibrations of it in the ground beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. Something was out there, and it wasn't just the wind. I looked at Adam, but he was staring intently into the forest, his face drawn in concentration. He looked terrified. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," I protested. "We need to stay here. We're safer in the light." But it was too late. Adam was already moving toward the tree line, his steps quiet in the deep snow. I wanted to call after him, to tell him to stop, but something told me I needed to stay put. Something was urging me not to follow. So I stayed by the fire, my gaze fixed on the shadows beyond, my heart pounding. Minutes passed like hours, and I could hear the wind howling in the distance. And then, through the howling wind, I heard a scream that sent a shock of pure terror straight through my chest. I jumped to my feet, the firelight flickering as the wind picked up, casting shadows across the clearing. My legs felt like lead as I ran toward the edge of the trees, shouting Adam's name. There was no answer, only silence, and then I saw him. Or rather, what was left of him. Adam was lying on the ground, his body contorted at an unnatural angle, his clothes torn and shredded. His eyes were wide open, staring at the sky, but there was something wrong with his face. A twisted look of terror frozen on his features. He had been dragged. Deep gouges marked the snow around him, and I could see the deep claw marks in the ground. I stumbled back, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The wind picked up again, and I swear I could hear a voice whispering on the breeze, soft, unintelligible words, like a chant. Then, before I could react, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing there, just the wind, carrying that strange, distant whisper. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually I managed to tear my eyes away from Adam's body and stumble back toward the camp. My mind was a blur of confusion and panic, and I knew I couldn't stay there. Not with whatever that thing was out there. I packed up our things as quickly as I could, trying not to look at Adam's body, not wanting to believe what I had seen. The wind howled louder now, almost like a warning, urging me to leave. I managed to drag my gear back to the car, and by the time I got there, the sun was just beginning to rise. I could feel the eyes of the trees on me as I drove away, and I didn't dare stop to look back. I never spoke to anyone about what happened that night. The authorities found Adam's body a few days later, but there was no explanation for his death. They chalked it up to an animal attack, but I know what I saw. I know what was out there in those woods. I don't know if it's some kind of creature or if it's something darker, older, something that the trees themselves keep hidden. I don't go to Pinecrest anymore. I haven't even set foot near those woods since that night. I don't know what it was that took Adam or why it spared me. All I know is that whatever it was, it's still out there, and it's waiting.
Next story.
I had always loved the idea of winter camping. Growing up in the city, I dreamed of the quiet solitude of the forest blanketed in snow, the peace of a winter night under the stars. So when my friend Jenna suggested a weekend trip to a remote spot in the Adirondacks, I couldn't say no. It was the perfect escape from the stresses of life, a chance to reconnect with nature. We packed our gear, checked the weather, and headed out early that Saturday morning. The drive was long, winding through icy roads and thick forests. The mountains looked beautiful, untouched by civilization, their peaks dusted with a fresh layer of snow. As we neared the campsite, the trees grew denser, the world outside the car turned quieter. It felt like we were entering a different world, one that hadn't seen human footfall in years. We found a secluded spot near a small frozen lake, far away from any trails or other campers. It felt like we had the entire wilderness to ourselves. As we set up the tent and unpacked our things, Jenna kept commenting on how eerily quiet it was. I brushed it off, saying that it was just the stillness of winter, but even I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was too quiet, too calm. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped significantly. We built a fire to stay warm, sitting close to the flickering flames. The lake shimmered under the pale light of the moon, and the trees around us stood like silent sentinels. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the branches. Around midnight, the wind shifted and we heard something. At first, it was so faint I thought I might be imagining it, a distant noise, like something scraping against the ground. I glanced at Jenna and I could see she heard it too. We both fell silent, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, scraping, dragging, like something heavy moving through the snow. My heart began to race. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Jenna's face was pale, her eyes wide. "I don't know, but it's getting closer." We stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, but there was nothing. No animal, no person, just the dense forest, blanketed in snow, stretching out into the unknown. The sound came again, this time much closer. It was unmistakable now, a dragging, scraping noise, like someone dragging a sled or a heavy object through the snow. But there was no wind to explain it, no reason for it to be happening. "I don't like this," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "We should leave, now." I agreed. We quickly started packing up our things, trying to stay calm, but the scraping noise continued, growing louder, as if something or someone was moving through the forest toward us. My hands were shaking as I stuffed our gear into the bags, and every time I glanced up, I expected to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness and snow. I turned to look at the lake. There, at the edge of the frozen water, something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved. Slowly, almost like it was dragging its feet. The figure seemed to be made of darkness itself, a shadow among the trees. I couldn't make out any features, no distinguishing details, just a tall, thin figure that seemed to glide, its movement unnatural. "Jenna," I gasped, pointing toward the lake. "Look." She turned, and her eyes went wide with terror. The figure was closer now, just on the edge of the trees. The scraping noise grew louder, like nails on a chalkboard, and the figure seemed to pause, as if it was aware we were watching. "Run," Jenna whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed the rest of our gear, and without a word, we sprinted toward the trail that led to the road. The snow crunched beneath our feet, and the trees seemed to close in around us. I dared not look back, but I could feel it. Something was following us, moving just out of sight in the darkness, scraping its way through the snow. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless and terrified. As we drove away, the figure stayed in my mind, its eerie, silent presence haunting me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, an overactive imagination fueled by fear and the isolation of the forest. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What we had seen out there, it wasn't human. The next day, I called the park rangers. I told them about the strange figure, but they seemed uninterested, dismissive even. "Could have been an animal," they said, "maybe a person in a heavy coat walking through the snow. But I know what I saw, and I don't think I'll ever forget it." Now, whenever I hear someone talk about winter camping, I think back to that night in the Adirondacks. The scraping noise, the figure in the snow, the feeling of being watched. It's a feeling I can never shake. And I know, deep down, that whatever we encountered in those woods, it's still out there.